I'm Master Chief Mark Hackley, U.S. Navy retired. I spent 30 years as a sailor, but I spent my whole life being interested in Navy uniforms, insignia customs, and traditions. So I'd like to share some of those with you using items out of my own personal collection as a starting point. So let's take a look and see what we can find in the sea chest today.
If you look at the uniforms of different navies around the world, you're going to find a lot of similarities. So much so that even if you'd never seen that uniform before, you could instantly recognize the individual as being a sailor. Now, one of the most common things amongst different navies is the headgear. There's a flat cap of some kind or another, and, well, let's take a look at a couple different examples. Here's one from the Spanish Navy, and one from the German Navy. Here's one from the Royal Canadian Navy and the British Royal Navy. This one's also from the British Royal Navy, but it's World War II, so it's blue wool instead of the white. Here's one from the old Soviet Navy. One from the Royal Netherlands Navy. And here's one from the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force. Here's one from the French Navy with the white cotton cover over the top for wear in summertime. Don't you love the pom-pom? And here's the same French one without the white cotton cover. So how is it that the U.S. Navy gets a hat that's so different from the hats of all these other navies? Well, let's go back to the beginning. In the earliest days of the U.S. Navy, there was no actual enlisted uniform that was specified. What they had was organizational clothing collectively called slops, but in a lot of cases that wasn't very well defined. One of the first people to lay out some specifics for U.S. Navy sailors was Captain Edward Preble of USS Constitution in 1803, and he said that all his sailors were required to have one hat or one hat and one cap, but he doesn't go on to describe them. In 1812, the Secretary of the Navy wrote a letter in which he specified what components constituted slops. His only reference to headgear is common hats. In 1818, Navy regs for the first time give a complete breakdown of all the different enlisted uniform components. For headwear, it only mentions having two hats. So what kind of hat is this? Well, it was common for sailors, both Navy and merchant, to wear a hat that was made out of canvas, and it was covered with either tar or paint to be able to make it waterproof. And that hat was called a tarpaulin. So if you take the word tar and the word pall, P-A-L-L, which means a covering, tarpaulin is covering with tar, and that's how the word tarpaulin came about for this hat. So all throughout the first half of the 1800s, a tarpaulin was an immediate indicator that this person was a sailor. Nobody else wore these things. And in fact, Frederick Douglass, when he escaped from slavery to freedom, he had worked in Baltimore in a shipyard as a caulker on board ships. So he took a blue sailor's jacket and a neckerchief and a tarpaulin hat, and everybody who saw him just assumed he was a free man, and he worked as a sailor. And he was able to get on a train and ride the train north to freedom. Now, the tarpaulin was not a very comfortable hat to wear. In fact, Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick, actually served in the U.S. Navy during this time period, and he lends some unkind words to the hat. The hard, unyielding, and ponderous man-of-war and Navy regulation tarpaulin hat, which when new is stiff enough to sit upon. He also went on to describe how it was so coarse and rough that every place on your head that you wore it, people ended up losing their hair. As you can see in illustrations from 1812, the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, the sailor's tarpaulin hat with a silk ribbon remains pretty consistent. The only change might be that you see the brim getting a little bit smaller. Navy regulations in 1833 mention several different kinds of hats for enlisted sailors. They say either black or white hats or blue cloth caps. Now, a couple of interesting things there. The black hat we know is the tarpaulin hat. The white hat, though, a little bit more confusing. It could have possibly been a canvas hat like the tarpaulin, just not covered with tar or paint, or it could be a straw hat. Now, We do start seeing straw hats coming in a little bit later on. They're not actually prescribed for enlisted personnel until after the Civil War in 1866, but there is visual evidence of sailors wearing these during and before the Civil War. So that's possibly what the white hat is. As far as the blue cloth cap, well, that's our first reference to the flat hat. 1852 Navy uniform regulations again mentioned the blue cloth cap. And in the next couple of years, 1853-54, there's illustrations of Commodore Matthew Perry's expedition to Japan. Now, in some of the lithographs, you can see the sailors wearing all tarpaulin hats. In other ones, though, like this one, you can see them wearing all flat hats. But through the 1850s, the blue flat hat was really starting to take over as being much more of a favorite, if for no other reason than it was much more comfortable than the tarp hat. So less and less you see it. By the time you get to the Civil War, the tarpaulin hat is still mentioned in uniform regulations, but you don't see any pictures of it. You see everybody wearing the blue cloth flat hat. Now, another addition that you get in the late 1850s to the blue cloth cap is a white cotton cap cover. So think back to that French Navy hat that had the detachable white cotton cover for wear in summer. So during the Civil War, you see all kinds of interesting photos with mix and match uniform component colors. So sometimes you might see a blue jumper, white trousers, and a white cap cover, or a blue cap cover, a white jumper, and blue trousers. In fact, this is sort of the origin of the Marine Corps blue-white dress that the Marine Barracks Washington Marines wear, is this kind of combination that the CO of the ship would put out for what the uniform of the day would be. Up to and during the Civil War, you would see some sailors who had the name of their ship painted on the silk ribbon that goes around the base. Now, it wasn't universal, and it wasn't mandatory. In fact, it was hit or miss until you got to 1869. That's the first time uniform regulations specified that the ship's name will be on the ribbon. And from that point forward, it's something fairly common. You see it in the 1880s. You see it in the early 1900s. Now, the flat hat takes a little bit of a different shape at this time because there's a metal grommet that's put in there to stretch it out. So it kind of looks like a big, pizza board. Now, here's an example of that wider flat hat from the World War I era with the ship's name on the ribbon, USS Cincinnati. Now, during World War I, that would cause a problem. Since sailors could only go out on liberty in uniform, and since they would probably go to the nearest establishments to the base, it wouldn't be too hard for a German spy to go to those establishments and be able to look at the cap ribbons and determine what ships were in port and relay that information back. So what the Navy did is in January 1918, they changed it so that everybody had a cap ribbon that just said U.S. Navy. So you can see that in this example here. The one thing I liked about this particular one is that the enterprising young sailor took his Liberty Pass and sewed it to the inside of his hat, so that when the time came for him to go on Liberty, all he had to do was get ready to cross the quarterdeck, take his cover off, show his Liberty Pass, and he'd be allowed to go ahead. After World War I in 1920, the Navy returned to having organizational cap ribbons. So in addition to ships' names, they specified a number of different kinds of shore establishments and aviation units that had their own particular kind of cap ribbon. So here this one says U.S. Naval Hospital. It doesn't go into any more detail, doesn't say which one, so if you worked at any naval hospital, this is what you would end up wearing. In 1941, the Navy decided to standardize the cap ribbon again to read just U.S. Navy for everybody. Now, in these 1941 regulations, you see a different kind of flat hat coming into play. This one is smaller in the crown than its predecessors, and also it doesn't have the stiff grommet on the inside to keep it nice and taut on top. So this would be around for a few more years, but it was becoming less and less popular, and you don't see it all that much anymore. So here's one example from January of 1949 of Harry S. Truman's inaugural parade. And here we see sailors of the U.S. Navy Seaman Guard, soon to be renamed the U.S. Navy Ceremonial Guard, marching down Pennsylvania Avenue with the blue flat hats on. As the years ensued, the flat hat became more and more an item that rested in the bottom of the sea bag. So finally, in 1963, the Navy eliminated it completely. I started off talking about the U.S. Navy enlisted white hat. So now it's time to circle back to that. The white hat descends from two different sources. One is the white cap cover that came in right before the Civil War for the flat hat. The other is the straw hat. Now, in 1866, the straw hat was authorized for enlisted sailors. It already had been for officers, and we know that enlisted personnel wore it because we have these photographs. But it became a standard part of the uniform for hotter climates, and so we can see examples of that. By the time we get a little further down the line to 1886, we see some great changes. 1886 Navy uniform regulations were fantastic for a number of reasons. One, they had exceptional color plates with illustrations of all the different uniform components and how the uniforms were supposed to look. But also, this is the first time where the U.S. Navy has multiple grades of petty officer. So it's the petty officers and below who end up wearing this white hat. The 1886 Navy Uniform Regulations for the first time describe this article. It's listed as hat canvas, in parentheses. For all enlisted men except bandsmen, 8-ounce cotton duck, well shrunk before cutting and without sweat leather. So that's the very first reference that we have to a Navy white hat. And we can see the illustration of how it was portrayed in the regulations. And we can get a good look at how it was supposed to go with a white uniform. And here's an example from my collection. Now, as you can see, that brim doesn't look anything like what the current U.S. Navy white hat looks like. You see that there's only about 20 rows of stitching in it, if that, and it's very loose, and it makes kind of a gutter around the head. The 1886 style hat would remain around for a number of years. We can see it illustrated in photographs of different ships' crews of the time period. We can see it illustrated in the 1905 Navy Uniform Regulations. It's not till 1913 that we start seeing something different. We start seeing a hat whose brim goes upward. So this came about through a number of different things. Sailors of the time period would do something to try to make themselves stand out a little bit more. They would get what they called stitched white hats. Now, by that, it means that you put extra rows of stitching into the brim to make it stiffer, and you anchored it down at the base of it to make it go vertical and not that gutter that you had in the 1886 style hats. So you would have people that sold gidunk to sailors do this, or if you had somebody on board the ship who was good with a sewing machine, you could have them do it. So here's an example of what one of those stitched white hats / 1913 white hats looks like. Now again, it doesn't look exactly like the modern one, but it's getting much, much closer to it. And again, if you were to take this thing and look at it closely, you would see that the brim has been stitched down by the sweatband to be able to make sure that the brim is going straight up. Now, following World War I in 1922, Uniform Regs shows a white hat that looks pretty close to the one that we wear now. The next one in 1941 definitely shows a white hat that anybody wearing one today would recognize. Now, if you were to see the two of them up close, you would be able to detect some subtle differences. The thickness of the brim in the current one is a little greater than the one that came out in 1922. And although there's many more rows of stitching compared to earlier versions, we're getting into that area where we have 70 to 75 rows of stitching going around the brim. The pattern, the machines that did it, sewed it in a different pattern. And so if you looked at a modern one and one from World War II, you'd be able to tell the difference. But from a distance, they look pretty much the same. Now, while the pattern of the white hat is pretty much the same as the modern, the manner of wear was very different. A typical sailor would wear the hat one way for liberty or for work, and wear it another way for musters and inspections and whatnot. The distinct shape of the hat came about as a result of how the typical sailor carried his hat when he wasn't wearing it. What they would do is they would take the sides of the brim and sort of pinch them together and then roll and fold the hat in toward itself. And that way you had sort of a triangular small package that could fit in a back pocket. So after a while of doing this, it sort of trained the brim so that when you undid it, it had these wings on the inside. Take a look at the top of the white hat here, and you will see a small tab. That was to run a string through to be able to tie to a clothesline to be able to dry the white hat after it had been scrubbed and washed. But it also comes into play with regard to the manner of wear. Here's one of my examples of a World War II white hat. Now you can see the wings coming off the side that I described. After you unfold that hat, those are just built in there. So typically you would not find a sailor wearing the hat exactly like this, square on the head. If they were out on liberty or if they were working, they would typically wear it on the backs of their heads. Now, where that tab that I was talking about comes to play is that a World War II veteran told me that what they used to do is take a bobby pin and run it through that tab and then run it through their hair to be able to keep the hat in place on the back of their head. So, neat little sailor's trick. On the other hand, if sailors were being inspected or doing something formal, they would tend to wear the hat forward on the head, but they would have it cocked to one side or another, giving it a jaunty angle. The thing is, 1941 uniform regulations didn't really say how to wear it, just described the hat as it was. Here's something unusual and pretty hard to find. This is a white hat that's been dyed blue. During World War II, not every ship, not throughout the entire war, but at certain times on certain ships, the sailors were told to take one or two of their white hats and dye them blue. The purpose for that was to be able to hide any dirt from doing grimy work. So here's an example that we see of a burial at sea being done by a ship during World War II, and you see that the pallbearers are actually wearing the blue white hat. A new uniform came in for chiefs and officers during the war, and the uniform was gray, same color as the ships. It was intended to be a replacement for khakis, but it never quite made it that far, especially if you were deployed in the far reaches of the Pacific. So you actually do see some photographs where it's a mix and match of people wearing khaki and gray if they're chiefs and officers. So there was a plan to make a uniform for petty officer first class and below also in gray, and it was going to be cut like the what was called the undress white uniform. That is the white jumper without the piping on the collar and cuffs. And plans were underway to do it. There were rating badges that were made, and there were even white hats made in gray. But about the time that they were trying to get ready to go into big production, that's when it looked like there was going to need to be a full-scale invasion of the Japanese home islands. And so all the textile mills had to focus on making sateen greens or herringbone twill greens for the Army, the Marines, and the sailors who were attached to them. So as a result, in 1944, they canceled the plan to continue making the PO1 and below gray uniform, but there are still out there a few surviving examples of rating badges and hats such as this one you see here. The white hat remained pretty much unchanged for the next couple of decades, through Korea, through the Vietnam War, but in 1971 plans were made to go ahead and put all petty officer first class and below in the same uniform that chiefs and officers wore. So it would be a double-breasted suit with silver buttons instead of gold, and a combination cap with its own cap insignia. Now, that was going to go into play in 1973, and as soon as it did, it was really recognized to be kind of a bad move. Sailors typically just had a tiny wall locker and maybe a locker under their rack, and taking a suit and tie and a combination cap and trying to crush them into those things, it didn't make you look all that good when you had to stand in an inspection or go out on liberty. So people started complaining that they looked like bus drivers, and so they started hankering to bring back the crackerjack uniform and the white hat. Now, during this period, not everybody went away. There was one element that retained the crackerjack uniform and the white hat, and that was the U.S. Navy Ceremonial Guard. So you can see in this photograph from 1976 that they were still wearing the standard traditional Navy uniform. Starting around this time, the mid to late 1970s, the U.S. Navy Ceremonial Guard in Washington, D.C. started doing something distinct with their white hats. They started taking and turning down the brim a quarter of an inch or thereabouts and having it parallel to the deck. And that is a tradition that the Ceremonial Guard follows to this day. It is authorized for them and them alone in U.S. Navy uniform regulations. So if you see any ceremonies or public events in Washington, D.C. that feature the Navy Ceremonial Guard, you will see them with this white hat.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Check back periodically as I'll be adding some additional videos as time goes on. Thanks for watching.